The heavy inspection boots of General Vance suddenly stopped, their dark polished leather contrasting sharply with the pale, wind-stripped concrete of the forward operating base. He stood directly over the custom-matted finish of the heavy Barrett .50 sniper rifle, a weapon that bore the distinct, battle-worn scars of long deployments in the northern jagged ridges. The entire section held its breath, the silence stretching tight like a tripwire across the humid tarmac of the staging area, where 36 veteran operators stood at rigid attention. Vance bent down slightly, his weathered eyes narrowing as they locked onto the small, custom-engraved steel crest embedded neatly into the rifle stock, the unmistakable designation of a 3,200-meter confirmed elimination. For 3 long seconds, the only sound was the low hum of the perimeter generators, until the general raised his gaze, bypassed the row of decorated male scouts, and fixed his eyes directly on me. He did not see the elite shadow the command had tried to bury, but rather the quiet recruit who had spent 3 years listening to the heavy laughter of men who swore a woman would never survive the recoil of the long gun. I watched his hand slowly trace the edge of the weapon mount, his expression shifting from routine military indifference to something raw and deeply unsettled. The badge was never supposed to be on this rifle, and my name was never supposed to be on the official logbooks that lay locked in the high command vault. As Vance stepped closer, his shadow falling over my boots, I felt the cold weight of the brass casing tucked hidden inside my uniform pocket, the final round from a ridgeline 5 months ago that everyone in this camp pretended had never existed. The general leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh, quiet rasp that barely carried over the mountain wind, demanding to know exactly whose blood had paid for the mark on that cold iron frame. The laughter in the mess hall during my first winter deployment always carried the same heavy, dismissive tone, a sharp contrast to the quiet focus I had maintained since leaving the flat plains of my hometown. They looked at my smaller frame and saw an absolute liability, a political checkbox forced into a tight-knit scout platoon that valued nothing but raw physical mass and years of muddy experience. Sergeant Miller used to drop the heavy cleaning kits on my canvas cot with a smirk, telling the surrounding men that the Army was getting soft enough to let delicate hands handle the heavy-caliber anti-materiel rifles. I never replied to the jokes or the deliberate exclusions, choosing instead to spend my late nights in the dim armory, memorizing the weight of the bolt carrier group and the exact resistance of the match-grade trigger. My father had taught me how to read the shifting wind on the high wheat fields back home, showing me how to watch the grass ripple to judge the speed long before I ever held a piece of military hardware. The real tension did not build from the open mockery, but from the quiet, systematic way the senior leadership began to reroute my patrol schedules as the deployment wore on. While the rest of the platoon drew standard assignments along the secure supply routes, my name began appearing exclusively on the isolated high-altitude observation posts overlooking the gray, jagged canyons. The logs were always signed by Captain Reynolds, a man who never looked me in the eye during the morning briefings but always ensured my spotter was a rotating cast of inexperienced privates who could barely read a topographic map. I started noticing that my ammunition allocations were logged differently from the rest of the team, the heavy match-grade rounds tracked on handwritten clipboards rather than the digital inventory system. One evening, while cleaning the long barrel under the dim light of the bunker, I found a small red stamp on the underside of my deployment order sheet, a classification code that officially labeled my unit as a non-combat support detachment, despite the fact that we were sitting less than 3 miles from the hostile border. The air grew thinner as the winter months rolled into the mountains, and the casual jokes from the platoon slowly transformed into a tense, watchful silence whenever I entered the operations tent. I watched the map markers move closer to the northern ridgeline every morning, noting how the command staff deliberately left a 3-kilometer gap in the defensive perimeter right below my designated observation post. Miller stopped smirking, replacing his arrogance with a cold, administrative distance that felt far more dangerous than his old insults. He began demanding my personal field notebooks at the end of every watch, claiming they needed to verify the wind data, though I knew he was checking to see exactly how much of the surrounding terrain I had mapped out. The final warning came not from a person, but from the sudden, unannounced departure of the entire neighboring platoon, leaving my isolated 3-person observation team completely exposed on the highest, coldest shelf of the mountain with nothing but a broken radio link and a weapon they swore I could not shoot. The supply trucks that normally arrived on Tuesday morning stopped coming altogether, their absence explained away by sudden logistical reallocations that nobody bothered to justify to a support unit. I watched the dust clouds rise from the main valley road as the heavy armor units pulled back toward the primary base, leaving our sector entirely hollowed out. Harris kept adjusting the dials on the field terminal, his knuckles red from the biting cold as he tried to find a clear channel through the wall of electronic interference that had suddenly blanketed the entire mountain chain. The daily intelligence summaries that usually detailed enemy movements along the border were replaced by blank sheets of standard administrative forms, signed in advance by Reynolds to give the illusion of regular reporting. I walked out to the edge of the perimeter wire, looking down into the deep, shadow-filled throat of the gorge where the hostiles had been gathering their strength for months. It was a perfect trap, constructed not out of barbed wire and landmines, but out of silent reassignments, missing supplies, and the deliberate blindness of men who wanted my presence erased from their official records. The broken radio hissed with static every 12 minutes, a rhythmic, dead sound that felt like a countdown while the mountain frost crawled up the steel tripod of the Barrett. My spotter, a terrified 18-year-old named Corporal Harris, kept wiping his fogged lenses, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the rangefinder steady against the biting wind. The coordinate sheets Captain Reynolds had handed us before the blackout did not match the landmarks below us, indicating an empty valley where my eyes could clearly see a heavy, unauthorized convoy settling into the throat of the gorge. It became impossible to ignore the pattern when I checked the digital ledger of the rifle's internal ballistics computer and found that the previous 3 months of zeroing data had been completely wiped from the hard drive. They had not just left us alone on the high shelf. They had stripped the weapon of its memory, ensuring that any shot taken from this altitude would be a blind guess into a freezing void. The realization settled in my chest not as panic, but as a cold, absolute clarity that made the blood in my veins feel like ice water. I forced my fingers to remember the manual adjustments, calculating the air density by the way the frozen mist clung to the rocks and the bullet drop by the sheer gravity of the drop beneath our boots. Harris suddenly whispered that he found a hidden log underneath the battery compartment of the radio, a single encrypted transmission string sent from our command base to an unlisted frequency 48 hours ago. The message contained only 2 things: the exact GPS coordinates of our isolated nest, and the specific time our thermal cloaking blankets would be deactivated from the central network. Someone in that warm, secure operations tent down below had systematically turned our position into a beacon for the heavy mortar teams currently setting up their tubes in the valley. The wind shifted violently, howling through the open chassis of the long gun as the first enemy mortar tube flared orange in the valley 3 kilometers away. I did not ask Harris for the range because I already knew the numbers by heart, having spent 3 months measuring the distance in my nightmares while the platoon laughed at my presence. The first heavy shell impacted 50 yards below our ledge, showering the concrete with sharp shale and throwing Harris backward into the dirt, with a scream that was swallowed by the mountain. As I dragged the heavy steel frame of the rifle into the direct line of fire, my eye pressed against the cold rubber of the optic, focusing on the tiny thermal signature of the enemy commander standing beside the artillery line. The crosshairs bounced with my heartbeat until I breathed out, letting the frost leave my lips, and pulled the match trigger, knowing the sound would reveal a truth that the high command had spent years trying to bury. The concrete under my chest cracked as the concussion traveled straight through the rock, but my focus remained locked on the narrow field of view within the glass. Harris was scrambling back to his feet, his fingers clawing at the loose gravel as he tried to drag the secondary ammunition crates closer to the firing step. Through the dark haze of the valley, I could see the enemy lines shifting, their movements indicating that they expected no retaliation from a position they had been told was completely abandoned. The digital display on my secondary handheld terminal flickered twice before dying completely, confirming that the main base had severed the last remote telemetry link to our position. We were completely severed from the grid, reduced to two figures on a frozen cliffside holding a weapon that the logistics sheets claimed was sitting in a maintenance depot down south. Every instinct told me that the real threat was no longer the mortar fire rising from the gorge, but the silent pen strokes of the men who had signed our names to this coordinate sheet. The muzzle flash illuminated the gray rock for a fraction of a second, the massive recoil slamming into my shoulder with a familiar, violent force that rattled the marrow of my bones. Through the high magnification optic, I watched the heavy match-grade round tear through 3,000 meters of freezing air, defying the crosswinds before striking the steel shield of the enemy artillery piece. The explosion of fragmented metal and secondary mortar charges turned the distant valley floor into a brilliant, chaotic sheet of orange flame, momentarily blinding the night vision tracking systems. Harris was coughing through the smoke behind me, his hands clutching a shoulder torn by shale, but his eyes were wide as he watched the enemy line collapse into absolute panic from a single, impossible shot. They did not look for a sniper on the high shelf because their map data told them no human could calculate a solution at that distance in a blinding mountain gale. We did not wait for the smoke to clear before I began dismantling the tripod, my fingers moving with a swift, mechanical precision that bypassed the tremor of adrenaline. The encrypted radio suddenly flared to life, breaking its long silence, but it was not a rescue command or an evacuation order that came through the small speaker. The voice was unmistakable, the calm, measured tone of Captain Reynolds instructing the recovery team to log our position as compromised by enemy artillery with 0 expected survivors. He was already writing the final report before the shells had even stopped falling, his words confirming every dark suspicion that had grown in the corners of my mind during the long deployment. I reached down and pulled the internal data chip from the radio console, putting the small plastic square beneath the steel badge on my uniform vest alongside the spent brass casing. The descent down the frozen backside of the ridge took 4 grueling hours, with Harris leaning heavily against my side while I carried the full weight of the disassembled Barrett across my shoulders. We avoided the main supply routes, sticking instead to the jagged runoff channels where the shadows were deep enough to hide our silhouettes from our own perimeter drones. When we finally reached the outer wire of the staging base as the first light of dawn broke over the peaks, the guard towers remained dark, their spotlights pointedly turned away from the eastern approach. I did not head toward the medical tent or the platoon quarters, walking instead straight through the center of the morning assembly area toward the command trailer. The heavy boots of the morning shift were just beginning to stir, completely unaware that the ghost they had left on the high mountain had just walked through the front gate with the evidence of their betrayal locked in her fist. The cold air outside the command structure felt thick with the scent of diesel and morning rations, a normal routine that felt completely surreal given the fire we had just walked through. I could see the light burning inside the main office window, casting a dull yellow square onto the frosted gravel path where the senior staff usually gathered for their private briefings. My fingers were nearly frozen to the aluminum frame of the rifle transit case, but the physical discomfort was secondary to the steady, rhythmic pulse of absolute focus that kept my stride perfectly deliberate. Harris stumbled slightly on the final step, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. But I caught his elbow and held him upright before pushing the heavy door open. The men inside were already laughing about the morning logistics reports, their comfortable isolation about to shatter against the weight of the data chip resting against my chest. The heavy aluminum door of the command trailer did not slam. It clicked shut with a terrifying, definitive finality that cut off the distant drone of the base camp. Captain Reynolds was sitting at his desk, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand as he reviewed the morning casualty templates, his face perfectly serene until he looked up and met my gaze. The coffee mug remained suspended halfway to his mouth, his fingers tightening around the ceramic until his knuckles turned a sharp, bloodless white against the gray light of the window. Harris collapsed into the corner chair with a groan, but I remained standing in the center of the room, the mud and frozen shale from the ridgeline dripping onto the clean linoleum floor between us. Behind the desk, Sergeant Miller scrambled to his feet, his hand instinctively dropping toward his sidearm before he realized exactly what weapon was slung across my back. The silence in the room became absolute, heavy with the weight of the data chip I laid down directly onto the center of the captain's pristine operational map. Reynolds looked at the small plastic square, then at the dirt caked beneath my fingernails, his expression hardening as he tried to claw back the absolute authority he had held over my deployment. He spoke softly, his voice a calculated threat, as he reminded me that unauthorized removal of communication equipment carried a court-martial sentence, deliberately ignoring the blood dried on Harris's jacket. I did not raise my voice, choosing instead to tap the digital interface of the console on his desk, forcing the encrypted audio log to play back his own voice, authorizing our abandonment into the empty room. Miller's face flushed a deep panicked red as the recording reached the segment detailing the coordinates of our position, the evidence stripping away every lie they had prepared for the official investigation. The door behind me swung open with a sudden blast of cold mountain air, and the entire room snapped to a rigid, trembling attention as General Vance stepped across the threshold. He ignored the officers completely, his eyes locking instantly onto the custom-matted finish of the Barrett .5, that I had unslung and laid across the briefing table. The general walked past the officers, his gaze fixed on the small steel crest on the stock, then stopped completely as his fingers traced the engraved numbers of the 3,200-meter confirmation. Reynolds began to speak, his voice stammering through a desperate explanation about atmospheric anomalies and clerical errors. But Vance raised a single hand to silence him without ever looking away from my face. I stood perfectly still, the cold brass casing from the ridgeline resting heavy in my pocket, knowing that the long years of mockery had just ended in the quiet room where the truth could no longer be hidden. The military police vehicles outside began flashing their silent amber lights against the frosted windows, their presence indicating that the high command protocol had already bypassed the standard chain of command. Vance did not look back at the door as the heavy boots of the security detail lined the corridor, keeping his eyes firmly anchored on the small terminal screen where the ballistic parameters were currently being cross-referenced. Reynolds tried to step forward, his hands twitching near his belt line as if he could somehow physically delete the records currently uploading to the main network frame. The room grew colder as the automated system confirmed the decryption keys, flashing a bright amber alert that formally locked out the local base administrators from modifying any further patrol logs. I could feel the dynamic shift in the room, the old authority structure evaporating into the quiet morning air until there was nothing left but the raw weight of the digital evidence. The general picked up the data chip from the map, his thumb sliding over the plastic edge before he slotted it directly into the command terminal on the wall. The audio file replayed, the cold words of Captain Reynolds echoing through the speakers once more, followed immediately by the automated ballistics log confirming the impossible distance of the final shot. Vance watched the digital graph trace the bullet path across 3,000 meters of freezing dark, his face hardening into an expression of absolute, unyielding judgment. He turned slowly toward Reynolds and Miller, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register as he ordered them to strip their insignia and surrender their sidearms immediately to the waiting military police outside. They walked out without a word, their heads bowed, the heavy weight of their own career-ending decisions finally catching up to them in the bright light of the morning. When the door closed behind them, the general turned back to the table, his eyes lingering on the battle-worn frame of the heavy rifle before meeting my gaze. He did not offer a hollow speech about resilience or apologize for the platoon's old insults, understanding that empty praise could never balance the scale for what had happened on the high shelf. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the official commendation star for elite marksmen, and placed it silently on the table right next to the Barrett steel receiver. I looked at the metal, then reached into my pocket and placed the spent brass casing beside it, the two pieces of metal clicking together with a clean, definitive sound that marked the end of the long struggle. The silence that followed was no longer the heavy, mocking isolation of the past 3 years, but a quiet, earned respect that filled the room. The morning sun finally cleared the peaks, casting long, bright rays through the trailer window and catching the dust motes dancing over the clean linoleum floor. Harris was already sitting up straighter in his chair, the color returning to his face as the medical team finally arrived to tend to his shoulder. I slung the long gun over my back one last time, feeling its familiar weight against my spine, but the old tightness in my chest was completely gone, replaced by a deep, enduring calm. Walking out into the crisp mountain air, I looked at the open staging area where the remaining scouts stood watching in silence, no longer seeing a liability, but an absolute professional who had survived the dark. The justice had not come through violence or loud confrontation, but through the quiet, unassailable truth written in the mountain snow and the steady rhythm of my own breath. The base camp slowly returned to its operational routine, though the atmosphere had permanently shifted, the old patterns of exclusion buried under the weight of the morning investigation. I watched the transport helicopter lift off from the main pad, carrying the former command staff away toward the regional tribunal where the official records would remain permanently out of their reach. The new supervisor assigned to the section did not look at my contract with a smirk, handing over the daily deployment logs with a nod of professional acknowledgement that required no extra words. As the sun dipped below the northern ridges, casting long blue shadows across the concrete pads, I sat on the armory bench and began the routine maintenance on the long barrel, the metal cooling under my fingers. My father had always told me that the wind eventually dies down to reveal the true shape of the land, and looking out over the quiet canyons, I knew that my place on this line had finally been carved in stone.